Section 22 of the Book of the Ancient Greeks. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by William Jones, Bonita Springs, Florida. The Book of the Ancient Greeks by Dorothy Mills. Part 2, Chapter 16b, The Downfall of Athens. Part 3, Alcibiades. The peace of Nicias did not last very long, however. Athens and Sparta were both too jealous of each other to be really reconciled, and neither kept to the terms of the peace. There was a party in Athens which favored peace, but it was not so powerful nor so popular as the war party, and its leader, Nicias, did not possess the qualities of leadership which characterized the leader of the other side. This leader was Alcibiades, a young man who had recently risen to power and who was very popular. He was of noble birth, rich, very good-looking, and of great personal charm. He lisped when he spoke, but it was said that this became him well and gave a grace and persuasiveness to his rapid speech. When he began to study, he obeyed all his other masters fairly well, but refused to learn to play the flute because, he said, it disfigured his face, and also because it was not possible to speak or sing while playing it. Alcibiades was a leader of fashion amongst the Athenian youths, and as soon as it became known that he despised the flute, playing on it went out of fashion and became generally neglected. Alcibiades was sought out by many people who liked to be in his company, chiefly because of his great personal beauty, but it is evident that at this time he must have shown many noble qualities and a good disposition, for Socrates, the great philosopher, showed much affection for him. Socrates saw that his wealth and position caused him to be flattered and made so much of by all kinds of people that he feared he would be corrupted by it, and he resolved, if possible, that his good qualities should be preserved. On his side, Alcibiades recognized the great worth of Socrates and listened willingly to his teaching. Both Socrates and Alcibiades took part in one of the early campaigns of the Peloponnesian War. They shared the same tent and stood next to each other in battle, and in one sharp fight both behaved with special bravery. This was the occasion on which Alcibiades was wounded, but Socrates threw himself before him and protected him, and beyond any question saved his life. Alcibiades had great advantages for entering public life. His noble birth, his riches, the personal courage he had shown in many battles, and the multitude of his friends and dependents threw open the doors for him. His popularity had also increased because of his success at the Olympic Games. He had spent great sums of money on horses and chariots, and never did anyone else send so many as 7 chariots to the games. And they were all so well equipped that in one race he carried off the 1st, 2nd, and 4th prizes, which far outdid any distinction that ever was known or thought of in that kind. But Alcibiades did not follow the wise teachings of Socrates, and he grew luxurious, dissipated, and lawless in his way of living. He wore long purple robes like a woman dragged after him as he went through the marketplace, and he had a soft and luxurious bed prepared for him on his galley. All this made him disliked by a great number of Athenians, and gradually raised up enemies for him. Yet such was his personal charm, his eloquence, his courage, and his beauty, that the Athenians made excuses for his excesses, indulged him in many things, and gave soft names to his faults, attributing them to his youth and good nature. Such was the man, unstable, ambitious, and unscrupulous, to whom was entrusted the guidance of affairs at Athens at this most critical hour of her fortunes. Up to this time, the relations of Athens with the Greeks beyond the sea had been chiefly confined to those in Ionia, but there were rich lands dwelt in by Greeks to the west, especially in Sicily and the south of Italy. Even in the lifetime of Pericles, the Athenians had cast a longing eye upon Sicily, but they did not attempt anything there till after his death. An opportunity for interference in Sicilian affairs was given to them in 415 B.C., when the peace of Nicias had brought a period of truce in the war with Sparta. The Greeks in one of the cities in Sicily appealed to Athens for help against Syracuse, which was oppressing them, and Alcibiades seized upon this as the first step in an Athenian conquest of Sicily. But this was the beginning of his ambitious plan, for he dreamt not only of the mastery of Sicily, but of nothing less than the conquest of Carthage and of Athenian rule over the whole Mediterranean world. Alcibiades roused Athens to enthusiasm for an expedition to Sicily, and the young men in particular shared his hopes and ambitions, and listened to him when he talked of the wonders of the countries to which they were going, so that great numbers of them might be seen sitting in the wrestling ground and public places, drawing on the ground maps of Sicily and the situation of Carthage. Nicias, conservative, experienced, and loyal, saw that it was not the welfare of Athens, but his own personal ambition and love of glory that was moving Alcibiades, and did everything in his power to dissuade the people from following such a rash and ambitious policy. He told them that even if they conquered Sicily, they could not hope to keep it, and that the course they were in favor of pursuing would only add to the hatred already felt for them by Sparta, and could only end in disaster. But the Athenians were deaf to the pleas of Nicias, and it was voted that the expedition should take place. Then the preparations began. Lists for service were made up at home, and orders were given to the allies. The city had newly discovered from the plague and from the constant pressure of war, a new population had grown up. But there had been time for the accumulation of money during the peace, so that there was an abundance of everything at command. While they were in the midst of their preparations, the hermae, or square stone figures, carved after the ancient Athenian fashion, and standing everywhere at the doorways, both of temples and private houses, in one night had nearly all of them throughout their city their faces mutilated. The offenders were not known, but great rewards were publicly offered for their detection, and a decree was passed that anyone, whether citizen, stranger, or slave, might, without fear of punishment, disclose this or any other profanation of which he was cognizant. The Athenians took the matter greatly to heart. It seemed to them ominous of the fate of the expedition, and they ascribed it to conspirators who wanted to effect a revolution and to overthrow the democracy. Certain metics and servants gave information, not indeed about the hermae, but about the mutilation of other statues which had shortly before been perpetrated by some young men in a drunken frolic. And of this impiety they accused, among others, Alcibiades. A party who were jealous of his influence over the people took up and exaggerated the charges against him, clamorously insisting that he was at the bottom of the whole affair. In proof, they alleged the excesses of his ordinary life, which were unbecoming in the citizen of a free state. He strove then and there to clear himself of the charges, and also offered to be tried before he sailed, for now all was ready, in order that if he were guilty, he might be punished, and if acquitted, might retain his command. But his enemies feared that if the trial took place at once, he would have the support of the army, and that the people would be lenient. They therefore exerted themselves to postpone the trial. To this they proposed that he should sail now and not delay the expedition, but should return and stand his trial within a certain number of days. Their intention was that he should be recalled and tried when they had stirred up a stronger feeling against him, which they could better do in his absence. So it was decided that Alcibiades should sail. About the middle of summer, the expedition started for Sicily. Early in the morning of the day appointed for their departure, the Athenians and such of their allies as had already joined them went down to the Piraeus and began to man the ships. The entire population of Athens accompanied them, citizens and strangers alike. The citizens came to take farewell, one of an acquaintance, another of a kinsman, another of a son. The crowd they passed along were full of hope and full of tears, hope of conquering Sicily, tears because they doubted whether they would ever see their friends again, when they thought of the long voyage on which they were sending them. At the moment of parting, the danger was near, and terrors which had never occurred to them when they were voting the expedition now entered into their souls. Nevertheless, their spirits revived in the sight of the armament in all its strength, and of the abundance of provisions which they had made. The strangers and the rest of the multitude came out of curiosity, desiring to witness an enterprise of which the greatness exceeded belief. No armament so magnificent or costly had ever been sent out by any single Hellenic power. Never had a greater expedition been sent to a foreign land. Never was there an enterprise in which the hope of future success seemed to be better justified by actual power. When the ships were manned and everything required for the voyage had been placed on board, silence was proclaimed by the sound of the trumpet, and all with one voice, before setting sail, offered up the customary prayers. Those were recited not in each ship, but by a single herald, the whole fleet accompanying him. On every deck, both officers and men, mingling wine in bowls, made libations from the vessels of gold and silver. The multitude of citizens and other well-wishers who were looking on from the land joined in the prayer. The crews raised the paean, and when the libations were completed, put out to sea. In due time they reached Sicily, where the generals in command held a conference as to the best way of beginning the attack. In the meantime, the enemies of Alcibiades in Athens took up the charges of impiety which had been made against him, and did not rest until an order had been sent to Sicily ordering his return, that he might be brought to trial. From every quarter suspicion had gathered around Alcibiades, and the Athenian people were determined to have him tried and executed. So they sent a summons to him and to others against whom information had been given. He was ordered to follow the officers home and defend himself, but the latter were told not to arrest him, for the Athenians, having regard to the interests in Sicily, were anxious not to cause excitement in their own camp or to attract the attention of the enemy. So Alcibiades and those who were accused with him left Sicily. They sailed in their own ship, but were escorted by the Athenian galleys sent for them. Before reaching Greece, both ships put in at a port in Italy, and here Alcibiades and his companions left their ship and disappeared, fearing to return and stand their trial when the prejudice against them was so violent. They were sought for, but the crew of the galley could not find them, and so they gave up the search and returned home. Before making plans for a further escape, Alcibiades lay concealed for a short time in Italy. It seemed strange to one who was with him that he had not enough faith in Athenian justice to return home and face a trial. But when asked if he did not trust his own native country, Alcibiades replied, quote, "In everything else, yes, but in a matter that touches my life, I would not trust even my own mother, lest she might by mistake throw in the black ball instead of the white." Close quote. As Alcibiades did not appear in Athens to answer the charges against him, the assembly convicted him and his companions of impiety, confiscated their property, sentenced them to death, and pronounced a solemn curse on their names. When this news reached him, all he said was, quote, "I will make them feel that I am alive." Alcibiades kept his word. He crossed to the Peloponnesus and went first to Argos. When he found there was no hope of his returning to Athens, he sent a message to Sparta, asking for a safe conduct to that city, and assuring the Spartans that he would make them amends by his future services for all the mischief he had done them while he was their enemy. The Spartans gave him the security for which he had asked, and he went to them eagerly, and was well received. In return for this, he betrayed the weak points of his native city to her enemies, and gave them valuable advice as to the best means of conquering Athens. Now, one characteristic of Alcibiades was the extraordinary ease with which he could adapt himself to his surroundings. Whenever he saw that it was to his own interest to adopt the habits and ways of those with whom he was in contact, he did so with no hesitation. At Sparta, he gave himself up to athletic exercises. He cut his hair short, bathed in cold water, and dined on black broth. In Ionia, he was luxurious, gay, and indolent. In Thrace, always drinking. In Thessaly, ever on horseback. And when later he lived with the Persian satrap, he exceeded the Persians themselves in magnificence and pomp. But though in Sparta, Alcibiades lived as a Spartan, and appeared devoted to their interests, he was nevertheless an Athenian, and the Spartans did not trust him. The Greeks never wholly trusted each other, and the lack of sincerity in their political relations was one of the weak points in their character. When Alcibiades found that he was looked upon with suspicion in Sparta, and that his life was actually in danger, he fled to Ionia and took refuge with the Persian satrap, with whom he had become a great favorite. And indeed, the charm of daily intercourse with this extraordinarily fascinating and dangerous man was more than anyone could resist. Even those who feared and envied him could not but take delight and feel a friendliness toward him when they saw him and were in his company. It was only in his absence that his real character was recognized. And now followed a period of disloyal intrigue with the Persians. Alcibiades advised them to interfere in the war between Athens and Sparta, and sometimes to help one side and sometimes the other, until both should be exhausted, that the Persian king could easily overcome them. Thus, not content with betraying the Greek to the Greek, Alcibiades descended to the shameful depths of betraying Greece to the barbarian. Part 4. The downfall of Athens and the supremacy of Sparta. Alcibiades had been summoned back to Athens at the very beginning of the expedition to Sicily. It was in the summer of 415 B.C. that the Athenian fleet had set out with such magnificence and with such hopes. 2 years later, news was brought to Athens, which at first the Athenians could not believe, so appalling was it. There had been a fearful battle in the harbor of Syracuse. The Athenians had been utterly vanquished, and great numbers had been imprisoned in the quarries, which were deep and narrow. The sun by day was still scorching and suffocating, for they had no roof over their heads, while the autumn nights were cold. They were only allowed about half a pint of water and a pint of food a day. Every kind of misery which could befall man in such place befell them. The Athenians had been utterly and at all points defeated. Fleet and army had perished from the face of the earth. Nothing was saved, and of the many who went forth, few returned home. The Athenians were at first in utter despair. Whichever way they looked, there was trouble. They were overwhelmed by their calamity, and they were in fear and consternation unutterable. The citizens mourned and the city mourned. They had lost the flower of their youth, and there were none to replace them. And when they saw an insufficient number of ships in their docks, and no crews to man them, nor money in the treasury, they despaired of deliverance. During the following winter, all Hellas was stirred by the great overthrow of the Athenians in Sicily. The states which had been neutral determined that the time had come when, invited or not, they could no longer stand aloof from the war. They must of their own accord attack the Athenians. They considered, one and all, that if the Sicilian expedition had succeeded, they would sooner or later have been attacked by them. The war would not last long, and they might as well share in the glory of it. The Lacedaemonian allies, animated by a common feeling, were more eager than ever to make a speedy end of their protracted hardships. But none showed greater alacrity than the subjects of the Athenians, who were everywhere willing, even beyond their power to revolt, judged by their excited feelings, and would not admit a possibility that the Athenians would survive another summer. Athens was hated because from being the great deliverer of Greece, she had become a tyrant and an oppressor, and the small states who had been ruled by her were more than ready to transfer their allegiance to Sparta, who held out promises of freedom from oppression if they would join her. Yet Sparta was at this very time bargaining with the Persian king and promising that she would recognize his right to rule over all that the great kings had formerly ruled, even the Greeks who lived in Asia Minor, in return for money with which Sparta would pay her sailors. Never had Athens sunk so low as that. The end was not far off, but Athens, having recovered from her first overwhelming despair, regained some of her old courage. She economized in every way so that new ships could be built, and kept on the alert lest she should be taken unawares by some surprise attack. It was at this moment that Alcibiades began to intrigue and plot for a return to Athens. Gradually, his friends gained the upper hand. The government of Athens had not been successful, and it was overthrown. It had been said that the feeling of the Athenians toward Alcibiades was that they love, they hate, but cannot do without him, and they proved the truth of the saying by recalling him. As of old, when once they came under the charm of his personality, the Athenians yielded to their enthusiasm for him. As soon as he was landed, the multitude who came out to meet him scarcely seemed so much as to see any of the other captains, but came in throngs about Alcibiades, and saluted him with loud acclamations, and followed him. Those who could press near him crowned him with garlands, and they who could not come up so close, yet stayed to behold him from afar off. And the old men pointed him out and showed him to the young ones. Yet there was a bitterness mixed with this rejoicing, for the Athenians remembered that it was by following the advice of this man that some of the greatest disasters had fallen upon them. The story of all that followed may be read in the pages of Thucydides and Xenophon. For a time Athens seemed to regain her old power, and she won so great a victory over the Spartans that these proposed a peace. But it was to be a peace as between equals, and Athens would hear of no peace unless she herself should dictate it. So the war continued until the ill success of some ships in an engagement with the Spartans caused the people to turn once more against Alcibiades, and again he was exiled. After that the end came quickly. In 405 B.C., one last great battle was fought, in which the Athenians were utterly defeated. The news of this disaster was taken to Athens, and it was night when the messenger arrived. When the tale was told, a bitter wail of woe broke forth. From Piraeus following the line of the long walls up to the heart of the city. It swept and swelled as each man to his neighbor passed on the news. On that night no man slept. There was mourning and sorrow for those who were lost, but the lamentation was merged in even greater sorrow for themselves as they pictured the evils they were about to suffer. On the following day the public assembly met, and after debate it was resolved to block up all the harbors save one, to put the walls in a state of defense, to post guards at various points, and to make all other necessary preparations for a siege. The Spartans came and closed in upon Athens. 150 ships were all moored off the Piraeus, and a strict blockade was established against all merchant ships entering the harbor. The Athenians, finding themselves besieged by land and sea, were in sore perplexity what to do. Without ships, without allies, without provisions, the belief gained hold upon them that there was no way to escape. They must now, in their turn, suffer what they themselves had inflicted upon others. At last, starved into submission, they surrendered, and terms were made with Sparta. They were bitter and humiliating terms. That the long walls and fortification of Piraeus should be destroyed, that the Athenian fleet, with the exception of 12 vessels, should be surrendered, that the exiles should be restored, and lastly, that the Athenians should acknowledge the leadership of Sparta in peace and war, leaving to her the choice of friends and foes, and following her lead by land and sea. The Athenians themselves were made to help in the destruction of the walls, and as they did so, their enemies rejoiced to the music of the flute, believing that with the fall of Athens would dawn a day of liberty for Greece. For over 30 years, Sparta ruled in Greece. At the beginning of the Peloponnesian War, she had demanded of Athens that she should restore the liberties of all the Greeks who were her allies. Athens had refused, and now the Greek world waited anxiously to see what use Sparta would make of her great victory. It soon became evident that the rule of Sparta was not to be a light one. Military governors were placed in every city of the old Delian League, and the citizens were forced to pay heavy tribute to Sparta. 30 men were set to rule in Athens, and for the 8 months that these 30 were in power, Athens endured cruelty, tyranny, and lawlessness. The Spartan domination soon became so unendurable that one by one a number of Athenians fled from the city and took refuge in Thebes. In Thebes, who had hitherto been one of the bitterest enemies of Athens, but who now realized that freedom and justice were not to be found in the Spartan ideal of empire, for it was nothing less than empire at which Sparta was aiming. At last a sufficient number of exiles had gathered at Thebes for them to make an attempt to drive out the 30 from Athens. They were successful, and the old Athenian form of government was restored. But there was no real peace, and for a few years fighting went on in different places. Sometimes Sparta was successful, sometimes Athens, but nothing decisive happened. At last Sparta began to intrigue with Persia, and in 386 B.C., Artaxerxes the king interfered in the affairs of Greece and proposed terms of peace known as the King's Peace, which were accepted. The Greek cities in Asia Minor were to belong once more to the Persians, and all the other Greek city-states were to be independent, and the treaty concluded with the words, quote, "Should any refuse to accept this peace, I, Artaxerxes, will make war upon them with the help of those who are of my mind, both by land and sea, with ships and with money." Close quote. It was the betrayal of Greece to the ancient foe. The Greek states had never been able to unite for long at a time. Had they been able to hold together, and especially Athens and Sparta had done so, they would have prevailed against the Persian in Asia Minor and maintained the independence of their kinsmen in Ionia. But their jealous fears of anything that might limit their freedom as independent states made any permanent alliance impossible, and the long years of Peloponnesian War, not all unjustifiable, had bred hatreds and suspicions, greed and jealousy from which Greece never recovered. But though politically her power was gone, her work for the world was not yet finished. Artaxerxes, the king of Persia, had a younger brother, Cyrus, who was accused to him of plotting against his life. He had Cyrus seized and would have put him to death, but his mother made intercession for him, and so his life was spared. This set Cyrus to thinking not only of how he might avoid ever again being in his brother's power, but how, if possible, he might become king in his stead. Now Cyrus was a man who was much beloved. He was honorable, upright, and chivalrous, and marvelously skilled in horsemanship. He understood not only how to make friends, but also how to keep them, and any man who did him willing service was sure to win his reward. For this reason Cyrus was always able to command men who were willing to follow him in any undertaking, no matter how dangerous it might be. In order to possess himself of the throne of his brother, it was necessary for Cyrus to raise an army, and he sent trusted agents to various places to collect as many men as would be willing to follow him on a hazardous expedition. Amongst other men who joined his army were a great many Greeks. Though the king's peace was not made for some years after this, the great battles of the Peloponnesian War were over, and there were large numbers of men who had spent so many years in fighting that they were restless and unwilling to return to their old settled life. About 10,000 Greeks joined the army of Cyrus, and in 401 B.C. they set out. These Greeks had not been told the real object of the expedition. They thought they were to fight against some hill tribes in Asia Minor, and they joined the rest of the army in Sardis, not knowing the long march they were about to begin. At first all seemed to be going well, but when they had gone for some distance, the Greeks began to suspect that they were going further than they had expected, and some of them wanted to turn back. But Cyrus promised to give them more pay, and they continued their march. On they went until they reached the Euphrates. They crossed the river, and for some days they continued their march along the opposite bank until they reached Cunaxa, not far from Babylon. Here at length Cyrus met the Persian army, which came against him under the king, his brother. A fierce battle followed, in which the Greeks were victorious, but Cyrus was killed, and so the victory availed them nothing. The Persians entrapped the Greek generals and murdered them, and there is nothing left for the Greeks to do but in some way or other to return to Greece. But Greece was more than 1,000 miles off, and they did not know the way. They had no leaders, they were in a strange land and surrounded by enemies, and they had no means of procuring supplies by the way. Nevertheless, they decided, in spite of all these difficulties, to choose new generals and to start. The chief of the new generals was a young Athenian called Xenophon, and he advised the Greeks, there were 10,000 of them, to burn all the baggage that they did not need and to set out and find their way as best they could to Greece. They followed his advice, and Xenophon himself has given us the account of that march of the 10,000 back to Greece. He called his story the Anabasis, or the march up country, and he tells us how they went through strange and unknown lands, and how they suffered from enemies, from cold and from hunger. They followed the Tigris for a time and followed the ruins of Nineveh, but so complete had been that destruction of that proud city that the retreating Greeks did not know that they were treading her beneath their feet. Winter came on, and the cold was terrible. In one place they marched through deep snow with the north wind blowing in their teeth, benumbing the men. They suffered from snow blindness and frostbite, and some of them, in despair, refused to go on. But in spite of these hardships, the greater number went on until at length they reached a city where they were given a friendly reception. The governor of the city gave them a guide, who promised that within 5 days he would lead them to a place from which they could see the sea, and, he added, if I fail my word, you are free to take my life. He kept that promise, and on the 5th day they reached a mountain which the men in front immediately climbed. From the top they caught sight of the sea, a symbol to the Greeks of home and safety. A great cry rose, and the shout grew louder and louder, so that Xenophon feared that something extraordinary had happened, and he mounted his horse and galloped to the rescue. But as he grew nearer, he heard the soldiers shouting and passing on to each other the joyful cry, Thalata, Thalata, the sea, the sea. When all had reached the summit, they fell to embracing one another, generals and officers and all, and the tears flowed down their cheeks. The sea was the Euxine, and without very great difficulty the Greeks found ships which took them home. But before they left the spot from whence they had first seen the sea, they erected a great pile of stones, on which they laid all that was left to them of their scanty possessions, some skins and wicker shields and staves, and these they dedicated to the gods of Greece for having granted them so great a deliverance. End of section 22.